Hello everyone. Now we move on to the ninth round of the Tata Steel Masters Tournament of 2024 and we'll look at two games from this round. The first of which is between Nodirbek Abdusattorov and Jorden Foreest. It's almost a miniature of the modern times. It starts with e4 and e5, knight f3 and knight c6, bishop c4 and knight f6, and d3. So it's the bishop's opening and d5 immediately. E takes and knight takes and castles. Bishop e7, rook e1 and f6. It's okay to play f6 in this position even though it opens the diagonal if black were to castle on the king side, and this will be important later on actually, and bishop goes to b3. a5. c3 here, just creating some room for that bishop to tuck back in. a4 was also an option that white can always play that, and here bishop g4 is an option with h3 and bishop h5 and then d4, and after let's say e takes and c takes and black castles, you have knight c3 putting pressure on the knight, and now we see that open diagonal and something like bishop h7 would be played, and this keeps some slight advantage to white, but this is quite playable. Although knight b6 was played immediately, threatening a4 and pushing that bishop back. That's a threat, but it also now exposes that diagonal completely. And knight h4 immediately. An option could have been a4 by white, just stopping that threat altogether and keeping that bishop on that diagonal. And let's say bishop g4, and after h3. Now, of course, we don't want to capture and allow, sorry, not over here. We don't want to capture here and allow queen coming to f3, and also bishop h5 and then d4. E takes, and there's an interesting move with knight to a3, allowing a further grab of a pawn, and you can play queen e2, putting pressure on e7. The knight could come to b5 or c4, the king is stuck in the center. The bishop could develop and then the other rook could come into play, so something like bishop to f7, bishop takes, king takes, and b takes c3. So both sides have to play carefully, and something like rook to e8 and rook to d1. White is slightly better here, and if you just go back and if you ever give up that bishop, then it's not pleasant whatever happens. So even white can give up more material here because of queen into g7, and after rook f8, bishop h6. If knight takes, then queen takes, and you have the pin, so it's quite good. So this was an alternative, but knight h4 was played instead, maybe threatening some queen h5 ideas in the future. And black took the bait and played g6 here. It's not strictly necessary. You could just go with like queen d7 and try to go for a queen trade. And here queen h5 is nothing special. King d8, and if let's say a4, then queen g4, then you trade queens. Queen takes, queen, bishop takes. This is perfectly fine for black. So after let's say queen d7, something like d4, opening the center because black's king is stuck. You have queen g4, and to avoid a queen trade and save the knight, you play knight f3 and a4. You kick that bishop away from that diagonal, bishop c2, and simply castle. And if let's say h3 and queen h5 and d takes, c5, you have rook d8. Because black is castled, this move is possible. However, with g6 it's slightly different. After g6, a4 by white, and black can no longer kick away that bishop from that long diagonal. If queen d7 here, then simply d4, and after queen g4 and knight f3, castling is not possible. So that follow-up, which allowed black to be okay, is not possible here. And this is why g6 was a mistake. Well, bishop d6 was played here, with d4 anyway. Well, why not open up the king side? Queen e7. Bishop h6 is very interesting. We add in another impediment to black castling on the king side, and also the rook on h8 will be out of play. There's no rook d8 possible here. Both the bishops are doing a very good job, but bishop e3 was played, solidifying d4, not as strong. Bishop d7, d takes e5, f takes e5, and knight f3. We can't castle immediately on the queen side because of knight g5 here. Just to be careful. And rook edge f8, knight e4. This is quite pleasant for white. There is pressure on b6, there's pressure on d6. So we have to be careful. So h6 first, just taking away the g5 square, and knight bd2 developing. Castles now, and knight e4. The other knight comes to e4. Bishop to f5, knight fd2 defending. And here it's very hard to find a move. Knight d7 was played, trying to remove that target from b6 and reroute the knight to the king's side or to the center. But let's say king b8, for instance. There you have queen e2. Queen g7, rook ad1. The pieces flow to good squares for white. Knight c8 and queen b5. And white is better here, no doubt about that. That's a clear advantage. But knight d7 allows bishop d5. Puts pressure on black's king this way. Knight to c5 and queen e2. Again, the queen can land on b5. Knight to b8 here. Rook ad1 first. There are possibilities. Knight b2 a6 was played, solidifying the c5 knight, but let's say knight into e4. You have knight into e4, and if c6, you have knight into d6. Rook takes and bishop c5. C takes, rook takes d5. We use the pin. Rook h to g8, and there's g4. If the bishop goes back, then you have rook into e5, which is very good. The bishop will be lost, and we'll also win the rook on d6 later. So bishop into g4, and now we can actually simplify. Bishop takes, rook check, knight c6, and bishop into e7. Rook d2 saving that piece, but after bishop d6 we can see that white has just upped the exchange. You can even give up this pawn for this pawn, it doesn't really matter. So no very pleasant lines. But after knight ba6, first knight into d6, c takes, and knight c4. And we see that there are weaknesses on b6 and d6. Queen to c7, queen d2. The threat is very simple, of pushing b4 and starting a pawn storm on the queen side. And both bishops are placed quite well. The knight on c4 is placed very well, and the rooks can swing to the b file or to the c file, whatever is needed. It was here that black actually resigned, and it's hard to recommend a move. For example, if knight b3 going after the queen, you have queen e2, and you go back trying to repeat simply g4. Bishop e6, bishop takes, knight takes, and bishop to b6. You win the exchange. All simple. And if instead we had knight e4 there, again queen e2, and knight ec5, you again play g4, and we have a similar line. So black is really in a bind here what to do, and thought, let me not torture myself, and just resign. So it's a modern miniature and a very good victory for Abdusattorov. That's why I wanted to show it. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon for the next game.